Hey everybody, welcome to the Synthetic Native Podcast. I've got a really cool guest today. His goes by the name of Hayden Lee. Is it Hayden Lee?
Yep, that's right.
Cool. And Hayden Lee, from what I gather, has done his fair share of VR development. I'm actually not sure. I know we'll be talking about web VR today, but I would be interested to find out how much of that was maybe web-based VR, if at all. Anyway, the big project that he's working on now is networked AFrame, which, and I'll definitely let you explain it, but which I believe is a framework for adding sort of networking, multi-user capabilities to the popular web VR framework, AFrame. And Hayden, I'll let you go ahead and introduce yourself and correct any mistakes that I just made.
Yeah. So, hey, thanks for having me on the show. I've been working in virtual reality for about 3 years, maybe 3.5 years now, since my last year of college. And most of that time I've been dedicated towards social VR or multi-user VR. So, a couple of years, or when I was just out of school, I worked on a startup called Converge. We got some money from Y Combinator and made a virtual reality social world. The next year, I was working with Dashar and Shankar on big screen, and that's doing really well now. I left big screen in December and started working on my own projects, as well as doing some contracting for some enterprise social VR work. And so this year I've been focused on that, on enterprise social VR with a company called Insight VR, and this new project called Networked AFrame, which, yeah, you described it perfectly. It's just a way to quickly drop in multi-user functionality to existing AFrame scenes. And it's been going pretty well. It started off as a small kind of side project, and now I think there's been more than 7 different programmers contributing to it, and I don't know how many apps are actually using it at the moment, but yeah, it seems to be kind of popular among the AFrame community.
That's really, really cool. Well, I've done just a little bit of hacking on WebVR. React VR, I did some hackathon project with that a while back. Can you enlighten, this is maybe tangential to the real thrust of the work that you've done, but do you see AFrame as being the leading web VR framework, and do you see React VR as any sort of competitor to it?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So React VR has a lot going for it. I haven't actually built anything with React VR yet, but I've been looking into it, and I have some friends that use it a lot. And the real advantage of React VR is that Facebook or Oculus has been using it to develop internal apps, like not for the browser. So they've somehow built a sort of rendering engine like you could have React Native, but they've built something kind of like React Native VR, and they're using that to power Gear VR Home and some of the new apps that they just announced at Oculus Connect last week. I think maybe the Oculus Dash may be using it as well. So that's like a real advantage, that you can use React VR, at least if you work at Oculus, you can use React VR for sort of native VR apps as well as pushing it to the browser. So that's one real advantage of React VR, and it's maybe not the most popular web VR app or framework because it's being used for these sort of internal Oculus projects, but it's definitely one of the most has a lot of users using it kind of unknowingly behind the scenes. Whereas I think AFrame is definitely it seems to have the biggest specifically web VR or like browser-based VR community. So yeah, if that makes sense.
That does make sense. Have you done a lot of sort of more traditional web front end development before the web VR stuff?
Yeah, so before I got into VR, I was doing just typical web development during college. I interned at the server hosting company called Rackspace, doing front end JavaScript work there. That was probably 4 or 5 years ago now.
Yep.
And so I definitely came from that web background. I kind of skipped mobile and then went straight into VR. And so, yeah, that's a really, really nice feeling to come back to web. And sort of during the day, I work on Unity for work and to pay the bills. But yeah, it's super nice to kind of finish work and get back to the web stack.
Yeah. So to the extent that you can talk about it, what do you do in Unity?
So I've been contracting for a company called Insight VR. They're based in Brooklyn, New York, and they do social VR architecture walkthroughs. And so selling to architects who then use it to show off their models to potential clients. And yeah, so it's sort of building, both being able to import and sort of annotate and edit these 3D models that architects can upload, as well as then being able to view those models at the same time as their clients, and in these sort of live presentations with avatars and sort of laser pointers, and you can just sort of walk your clients through your design. So yeah, and that's all Unity based.
That's really cool. It's a feature that about VR potential application that I keep hearing about, but I haven't put in the legwork to find a bunch of examples of it. This sort of like using it to, show off, architecture. So it's really cool to hear about that being applied. And so would you say most of the time you spend working on networked AFrame is sort of after your day job?
Yeah, it's definitely sort of side project status. It's I kind of at the start of the year wanted to like get into the open source community, and I don't know why I didn't just join somebody else's project, but I sort of saw the opportunity for this for how networked AFrame could work, and then. Just started building it. It took me a few weeks to build early this year, right at the start of the year. And then people seemed to like it, so I just kept sort of tinkering away, and and now it is where it is today.
Were you contracting in the beginning when you built the initial groundwork for it?
I don't think I think I was just taking time off at that point. I think I was just there was a few months where I went home to Australia for Christmas to spend some time with my family. I think I just built it when I should have been spending more time with them, I guess. But I just sort of built it in a few weeks before I got into contracting this year.
Okay, cool. Yeah, because I know people always have questions, especially in the sort of software development engineering world, about kind of what it takes to build a successful side project and things like that. And I glanced at your project. It doesn't have 20,000 stars yet or anything, but it definitely seems like it's seeing adoption. And you just said there's some active contributors to it, and so that's really, really cool.
It's sorry to cut you off, but yeah, it's getting more popular, I think, and I'm sort of measuring that by issues placed on GitHub as well as new contributors. And yeah, there's been more and more contributors in the last month, especially. So people seem to be kind of gravitating towards it, which is really cool.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously useful, and it has to be useful for people to want to contribute to it, because I know I've contributed to open source stuff, and it's never been, it has to reach a certain level of usefulness and need for me. And I think for most people, other than kind of the most passionate open source people, it's something that you're using that they probably even maybe have used at work or whatever. Have you seen, has somebody said, hey, actually we need this for this use case at our job or for this project, and you don't have it, and then they help to push that forward?
And sort of, you mean pay me to work on it?
No, not even necessarily paying you, but just doing it themselves or filing an issue for it, or are those things starting to bubble up?
Yeah, for sure. I'm seeing there's both sort of there's companies starting to use it. There's a few VR startups who are starting to use it, which is awesome and something I never really expected. And then there's definitely some pull requests coming in where people are building their own projects, and they'll then sort of push it back to the upstream branch, and we get those improvements, which is really cool, and sort of shows the real power of open source, where it just sort of keeps improving. It's such an awesome feeling when I wake up and somebody's pushed a pull request and new code and some new functionality that I wasn't even thinking about. And I sort of review it and merge it in, and yeah, it's a pretty awesome feeling.
Yeah, that is awesome. So let's just kind of dive right into it, I guess. Like, are there any particularly interesting challenges that come with VR, with networking and VR specifically?
Yeah, so there's a few different problems. And the web sort of limits what you can do with the networking stack and at the networking layer. What technologies you have available is definitely a very limiting. You've only got sort of a few different options. You've got WebSockets and WebRTC, and that introduces its own challenges in VR in general. There's a ton of issues. I think one of the issues I run into when I'm working on different apps is, as soon as you add social or a multi-user layer to anything, you suddenly need everything to be multiplayer. So if, for example, if you have, let's say you have a laser pointer, and it's just a single player app, and you have a laser pointer where you can sort of point to things. As soon as you add multi-user, now everybody else needs to see that laser pointer. They need to see your hands, they need to see your head, obviously, but all the different things in the world and all the different interactions, you need to show those as well. Another example is pulling up a menu. It looks sort of weird if you're looking at somebody and they're just pointing at this random space in the middle of nowhere. And it feels much more natural if you just show sort of a transparent menu or whatever menu in front of them. So you have some context as to what they're doing. So just, those are sort of two little examples, but that applies to everything. Everything in the world needs to be networked. And that's sort of for the application developers. Like, as soon as you add networking, you need to make everything networked, and that gets really tricky and sort of can exponentially make your app more complex. And yeah, so that's just sort of a general VR networking problem. But
yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And yeah, especially the transparent menu in front of people, like, so it doesn't look like they're just awkwardly fiddling in space. Have you ran into sort of a rule of thumb hard cap for the numbers of players that can sort of coexist in a VR environment? I mean, I'm sure it's dependent on so many things, like what you're actually rendering out and stuff. I imagine if it's a very, very simple, basic thing where it's not rendering out a lot of, if you're not having to actually maintain and map out that complex of an output, maybe it's a higher number. But in general, what is kind of like the number of people that can realistically exist in the same VR environment?
So it depends on a few things, as you said, one of the first decisions there is, or one of the first variables is what networking architecture you're using. So if you're using a client-server model where you have one server and everybody kind of sends their updates to that server, and then the server updates all the clients with the new information. In that model, you can push the networking a lot further. Each client, you're never going to be limited on the client, at least outputting to the server. I'll backtrack here a little bit. So you're sending one message every time, let's say every time you move, or generally it's about 10 times a second. You'll update 10 to 20. You'd update the server about sort of where your arm is or where your head is. So you're sending one update to the server every 10 times a second. And then the server relays that to all the other clients in the room. With that sort of model, I've built apps where we've had 80 users in the same room, all watching the same YouTube video. This was back in 2015. We Sean Whiting and I were making Converge, and we had a Twitch like video stream up in front of people, and it was actually the Oculus. We had a few Oculus live streams that we showed off like that. So one example was the Oculus consumer announcement in July 2015, and we were able to have 80 people all watching this together, which is a super magical experience, having that many people sort of react to something. There's a funny YouTube video where you can see when Oculus announced the controller, the Xbox controller, as sort of the main CV1 input, and you can hear sort of 80 people being like, "What?" and getting super angry. And then, so that's the sort of client-server model. I think you could probably push that, and I think High Fidelity, another sort of social virtual reality application, has, I think they've pushed 100 or 120. I know AltSpace has gotten sort of up in those numbers as well. So that seems to be sort of the limit with that model. I think it's actually possible, if you sort of dedicated yourself, I think it's possible to get more than that, but you'd have to start doing things like making the avatars look more simple, really optimizing like the bandwidth and the packets that you're sending over the network. Right. But I think it is possible to get like higher than that. But then the other model is client server, which is what I've been talking about so far. The other model is peer-to-peer, and that's a lot more limiting as far as how many users you can get in a room. And it's basically my rule of thumb is about like 8. If you can sort of have 8 clients or 8 users in the same room, and you're just very limited in that model, because you have to every user has to send 8 updates every time. They would usually just be sending 1 to the server. So every client has a connection to every other client. So there's sort of n. If you have n equals the number of clients in the room, you have n minus 1 connections. That math might be totally wrong. Anyway, you have one connection per one connection from each user to every other user. Yeah, that math was totally the wrong math.
But it actually sounded, sorry, so I think I'm totally wrong then too. You said there's a connection between every user to every other user, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So it is like n minus 1, right?
Yeah, I'm not good at doing math on the fly, but it's a lot. You're having a lot more connections than you would with a client server, where you're just connecting from the client to the server. There's only you sort of have one connection in that instance. Every client would have n minus 1, so you have n minus 1 times the number of clients.
Oh, right. So it's like a n squared type.
Yes. Yep. So that means every client has to be managing all these different connections, and just the bandwidth of sending out that much data and receiving that much data. You get a lot more limited, especially when you jump to audio, and then definitely when you get to, if you're streaming video as well. It's not something I've added to Networked AFrame yet, but I would love to add some video streaming support for a few different use cases. And yeah, at that point, you're really limited, because you're just sending so much bandwidth out. You have to decode a video at the same time, so you have to decode a video from every other user, encode a video to send out. A lot of challenges there, but with Networked AFrame, you can choose either of those architectures. So you can choose to do a client-server model, or you can choose to do a peer-to-peer. So that's a cool thing about the library, is that it lets you just switch with one line of code. You can just change a variable, and you can switch between which sort of architecture you want to use, and you can test out different ones really quickly. And that's all just sort of handled behind the scenes. So that's definitely one of the biggest advantages of the library. And then you can also write your own architecture. You can write your own networking backend, and then sort of write an adapter, I call it. Right. Write an adapter for Networked AFrame, which then lets you use your own backends without having to change the front end application code.
It's probably a topic for another podcast, but I'm really interested in the idea of writing like is it even possible to write like a peer-to-peer web app?
Yeah. So the by default, networked AFrame is client server, and that's using a technology called WebSockets. Okay. And that's for if there's sort of networking people listening, that's using TCP. And then you can use, as I said before, like you can switch that to a peer-to-peer model, and then you're using WebRTC, which is a peer-to-peer connection, and and then that's using UDP, which is you get some advantages there, but I don't want to go too far into the weeds if I haven't already. But yeah. So yeah, you can totally do peer-to-peer on the web. You run into those issues, as I said before, about how many clients you can have in a room, but it's super cool if you can do it in a way where you can be streaming audio and having voice chat, and in the future with networked AFrame, hopefully do video streaming as well. And you don't have to pay anything as a developer, as a host, because it's all that bandwidth is just going from clients directly over the internet to other clients, and you don't have a server relaying all those bits.
Okay, and I'm guessing that has some disadvantages as far as like if you need to do some validation on how those communications happen to each other. You have less control over those bits, basically.
Yeah, so in that situation, you have a server. You do have a server just to set up the connections. So just so each client knows the IP address and the ports and everything of the other clients. Once that happens, you basically don't talk to the server anymore. The bits just go directly to the other users. If it depends what you're doing. If you're trying to set up a game where you want to prevent cheating, for example. Let's say you're making like Counter-Strike on the web, then and you need to make it so people can't just cheat and can't find out where other users are, or like always make it so they're always hitting other users with their bullets. Then peer-to-peer is not a good model because you have no control over any of those bits, as you said. In those networking models, you generally have a simulation running on the server, and so you're running the entire application on the server and maybe only sending the inputs from every client to the server, and then the server sort of validates and verifies that it's all working properly. And that's typically not what I've been focusing on. Those sort of more extreme like games where you're really, really reliant on, or it's really, really important that you stop cheaters and hackers. I've been focusing mainly on sort of these simple social VR use cases where you're just hanging out with somebody else, and maybe there's a common something you're using. Like yesterday, I was trying a community member made a music sequencer. So you could sort of make little tunes and like jam with somebody else, which doesn't require this sort of like, you don't have to like stop hackers in that instance.
That's exactly what I was thinking of. It's just like cheating, for example.
Yeah.
So that I'm glad you kind of went directly to it. Well, okay, that's really interesting. I wonder, besides sort of the obvious ones, I don't want to say that they're obvious because I'm sure that there's tons of challenges and nuance to how you can build them. But I just want to pick your brain here. There's, social VR, there's obviously games, and there's kind of the architectural demos that you touched on earlier for your work with Insight. Are there any other cool applications of networked VR that you've been thinking about, or maybe you haven't even worked on but just have had the thought of?
Yeah, so there's definitely a lot of things, and there's you're starting to see a lot of different companies and companies fill out like the main ones that I've been thinking about. I sort of break it down into there's three categories which are sort of helpful, where you have sort of game-like or like sort of virtual worlds, and I'd probably throw applications like Altspace, like High Fidelity, like Rec Room, VR Chat. And these are just sort of non-web applications, but just sort of social VR.
Right.
Sorry if I missed companies there, but
Nope.
and then there's these non-gaming social VR or non-world building category, and I throw things like big screen, like the Wave VR, if you've tried that, where it's like you're having a dance party in VR, sort of non-gaming or non-world building applications. And then you have this other category like Insight, where you're doing purely enterprise. So you're selling to other companies, you're building a tool that is useful for a specific domain. And I'm trying to think of other enterprise social VR. There's definitely a couple of companies doing it with architecture. I've seen some data visualization stuff where you can sort of view data and graphs and charts in VR together. What else? I think architecture and real estate is sort of that most obvious enterprise application. I'm sure I'm leaving some stuff out, but yeah, those are the three categories that I mainly break it down into. And you're starting to see more and more sort of startups and companies doing those and filling those gaps.
What were the three categories? So you've got like game-like, virtual worlds. You've got non-gaming, non-gaming but world building, and then you have like enterprise.
Yeah, so I'd break it down into virtual worlds and game-like, either games or virtual worlds. I'd throw that into one category. Then I'd have non-gaming, but still consumer, like big screen and the Wave, and then enterprise, purely enterprise, like Insight. I might be biased because that's sort of the three things that I've worked on over the last couple of years. But yeah, those are the three. That's how I think about it. I'm sure people have other ways to think about it or other categories, but yeah, that's sort of my breakdown. There's another application that Oculus just showed off recently was the venues. Did you see this at Oculus Connect?
No, what was it called?
There's Oculus Venues. They showed it off just actually it might even be Facebook Venues. They showed it off, or Zuckerberg
I think
showed it off.
I think it is Facebook Venues. I think I heard about that.
Yeah, they showed it off like just I think it was only Zuckerberg that showed it off for a few minutes right at the start. I can't remember, Facebook or Oculus, whichever. It's all the same thing now. But that was another interesting application. I've been thinking about that a bit myself. I haven't made any progress towards it yet, but I think this idea of having large crowds in VR is a really interesting one that hasn't really been tackled yet. And it seems like Oculus Facebook is starting to go down that direction, which is really cool. But there's this idea of, I call it crowd presence. So you have social presence or stepping it back even further, you have presence where you put on a VR headset and you feel like you're in this world. And then you have social presence where there's somebody else in that world with you and you feel like you're with them. And that can be achieved by having sort of realistic movements and they react like a human would react. And we're just sort of starting the path down that trajectory at the moment in the industry. But that's going to be improved a lot with sort of eye tracking and facial movements. And then I'm sort of terming or coining this phrase of crowd VR or crowd presence, where you have sort of an entire, let's say a stadium, and you feel like you're really with sort of 100 or 1,000 other people. And we sort of saw in 2015, we saw some glimpses of what that feels like with Converge. And I haven't really seen, I haven't seen anybody any companies 100% dedicate themselves to that experience. But I think that's another application that could be really cool. And it seems like
to which experience? To which experience? The experience of mass.
Yeah.
VR.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. So like sort of 100+ people all experiencing something together, whether that's watching a video or sort of a presentation, or it could be an art performance or a DJ, anything like that. getting those higher numbers. I think that could be really cool. I personally love going to the football and being in that stadium of 100,000 people and feeling that roar is really cool. And I haven't felt that in VR. So I think that's just another opportunity for somebody to tackle as well. And I've been thinking about it a little bit, but haven't had the time yet.
Yeah, you mentioned social presence, and I probably haven't done as much multiplayer online VR as I should have for somebody who runs a VR podcast. But I think the first time I felt something very close to being like in another world, like a virtual world with another person, was in Echo Arena, and I could hear somebody basically talking to me very close to me in the game world, and that was like a very surreal feeling because immediately the first thing I thought of, I had been playing Overwatch, and Overwatch and online gaming in general has sort of a toxicity issue.
Sure.
And that's a whole other debate you could spend, and I'm sure Blizzard is spending hours and hours talking about. But the first thing I thought of was just how shitty it would be to be like in a virtual world with somebody being like extremely rude to you, because it felt like it would be almost like more personal.
Yeah.
You know?
It's a good, there's a really important question, and it's been brought up quite a lot so far in social BS history of the last few years. And even if you, I was doing I wasn't really alive or old enough at the time to be experiencing like MUDs and Moos, the sort of text-based virtual worlds of the 80s and 90s. Right. I think probably late 90s is when it was really, or mid to late 90s. And you've got things like Lambda Moo and these virtual worlds, and you saw a sort of abuse, and there's a book. I think it's called a rape in cyberspace. So these are like pretty kind of intense feelings and intense situations that were happening just in text-based worlds. And this is 20 years ago, and people were complaining about this and experiencing these like horrible things just in text. So now imagine once you get to VR and you're not just your brain is tricked. It's not just your sort of mental state where you think you're with this in somebody or in a world with somebody else, but your sort of physiological reaction is that you're with somebody else as well. And you can run into all these issues where personal space is suddenly a big issue. Whereas if you're playing like Overwatch or something and you run into somebody, it doesn't make you feel anything. You're just like, oh, like you don't really think anything. It's just like, oh, I should move so I don't shoot them or something. But in VR, if you sort of put your hand into somebody's face, that's going to cause like a real reaction and a real feeling in that for that person. And there's a lot of different techniques that startups are using to sort of combat these new problems. There's a great talk by Ralph Costa on some of these issues. He just goes really, really hard into a lot of these problems and how he takes a very hardline stance on how if you don't have some of these basic features, then you shouldn't put up a world, because you're just opening yourself to people getting harassed. And as sort of creators of this technology, like you don't want to create technology that can let people get harassed and harass people. So it's been starting to be talked about a lot. There's some of those examples of things you can do from a developer standpoint is one of the things I built a big screen. We were the first project to add a personal space bubble. So when somebody moves their hand or their head within a certain distance of your head, they just disappear. And that can cut down on harassment a lot, because you just can't see somebody. And if they're trying to annoy you, they just disappear. And that brings up all these other questions about like, what do other people in the room see? If there's a third person in the room and they're watching somebody harass somebody else, does the harasser disappear for that third person as well? And there's a good argument for that. And then there's sort of implementation details about, do you just completely fade them away, or just completely hide them, or do you sort of fade them away so that you still know kind of roughly where they are, but you don't feel it as much? There's just all this host of questions that are brought up with each of these problems. There's I think Rec Room has sort of been a good project that has been innovating on a lot of these different challenges. There's also, I'd say, another kind of cool feature to add. I don't know if Rec Room or these other startups have this yet, but you could do, if you're hosting a public room, you can do things like record the last 5 seconds or last 10 seconds of, or probably you want it even longer than that actually. So record, let's say, the last 30 seconds, and then if you report somebody else, then you can send those 30 seconds to the moderators, and then they can look at it manually and look at what was happening and see if somebody was actually harassing somebody else, and if so, then block them or ban them. So yeah, there's lots of problems there. We ran into problems even back in 2015 with a lot of these things where people just didn't know about these problems. They would walk into other people and even they'd just be sort of walking around and wouldn't even realize that they were annoying somebody, and it would really frustrate some people, and people thought they were being harassed, or felt like they were being harassed, and when people weren't intentionally doing it. So a lot of these tools sort of really help with that sort of stuff. And then you have a lot of these worlds are doing virtual world building, so you have the opportunity for trolling where you're sort of creating sort of penises, or you're creating whatever with these sort of Minecraft tools, and there's all those problems. There's with all the media streaming stuff, like where you can watch YouTube together, or in big screen where you're like sharing your desktop, then you can put sort of unpleasant or troll content on the screens. And we had, I remember in 2015, we had some kid who was like 10 years old who kept coming into the YouTube area and just putting up this like god awful like content on the screen that somehow wasn't banned from YouTube, and just trolling. So yeah, long story short, there's a lot of opportunity for trolling and mischief and harassment and all these problems that are sort of just being discovered, and then we're trying to figure out solutions for them.
Yeah, unfortunately, if you give people the power to build or show a penis in cyberspace, they are gonna abuse that privilege.
Yep.
Okay. By the way, you said somebody had given a talk, or like early, at the beginning of when you started talking just then a couple minutes ago. Was it Ralph Costa?
Yeah, Coster, Koster, I believe.
Coster. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's
cool.
that's a really really awesome talk. Definitely sort of scares when I was watching it as a social. I think I was working. I can't remember when that talk was actually, but it definitely sort of woke me up a bit to these problems and how serious they are. But yeah, I think it's this sort of like doing research into previous virtual worlds. There's probably not enough of that in the industry, where there's all these examples, like I said before, like Lambda Mu and these sort of even text-based, but then there's also the Second Life and Ultima Online, like these other, all these virtual worlds over the last 20 years. And there's a lot of these problems have already been solved in these previous virtual worlds, even though it's not virtual reality. And then virtual reality adds this other layer as well with the sort of physical embodiment aspect.
Yeah, I mean, the silver lining for me earlier with the experience that I had is that the thought I was having when I was in this world was, if this person chooses to be toxic, it's going to feel a lot worse than it would in a mouse and keyboard regular shooter game. But the silver lining there was that it seemed like everybody was kind of feeling a similar level of embodiment, and therefore I didn't hear anyone say any anything negative. And I'm not saying that harassment won't happen. I know it will, but at least in that moment, it seemed like people were, they were helping each other. A couple people were like struggling with the controls, and I could hear them like helping each other in the lobby of this game.
Yeah.
It was cool to see that it hadn't devolved yet, at least in that instance.
Yeah, it'll happen.
Yeah.
I think this was in 2000, when I was working at Converge, it was a debate that Sean and I had where there's a line of thinking where you could say, because you feel like a real person, because you're embodied in this virtual world, that less people will troll because they're kind of they feel less anonymous. They feel like just like you wouldn't punch somebody in the street, like you're not going to punch somebody in VR. And I sort of took the stance that it's the opposite, in that because you can affect somebody more in the virtual reality, that your sort of reward as a troll is higher. So more people are going to troll. Or I don't know if it's more people, but it's definitely going to be a thing. And I don't think virtual reality will stop trolling because of the embodiment aspect. I think it's going to be as prevalent, if not more prevalent.
Yeah, so it's going to be up to people to build that protections into their environment, and also up to us and individuals that are players to try to enforce some sort of culture.
Yeah,
just,
for sure.
Just like real life, I guess. Well, we're kind of running out of time here. I want to ask you though, a question that I pretty much ask everyone, which is just, what gets you excited about working in VR? What is exciting about VR going forward in the future? And by VR, I just mean, XR. It could be augmented reality
Sure.
as well.
So one of the interesting insights I had from working at big screen was that the people are already using some of these applications a lot. So in big screen's case, like we had users that were, and people are still doing this today as well, where people are using it for like 8 hours at a time, and other users using it for 40 hours a week. And this is Gen 1 hardware, this is Gen 1 applications, and that's pretty eye-opening. You sort of don't really get that insight if you're just following virtual reality, or if you're looking at virtual reality as an outsider, because the media is always like, oh, you can only last for 15 minutes in an application before you get sick or before you get bored. And yeah, having that insight at big screen or seeing that firsthand was crazy. So as the hardware gets better, as the software gets a lot better, I think it's almost inevitable that within sort of the next few decades, we'll be spending a lot of time, or there's going to be a lot of people that are spending a lot of time in these virtual worlds or in augmented reality, basically just wearing virtual goggles of some form. And I just see that as super, super important. I think if you have, there's a lot of problems that can happen to society if everybody is wearing like Facebook goggles, for example. I think that's like a really kind of scary thought, as well as being super, super empowering in that you have all these superpowers. So maybe this isn't a super optimistic angle, but like I think that's just it's going to be super, super important. And it's important that as a society we get it right. I don't like the idea of in 20, 30 years, us all being sort of strapped into sort of insert your favorite company to hate goggles, and just sort of under the control or sort of powerless against these bigger companies. That's one of the reasons that I really enjoyed working on open source and WebVR this year, where you have the user has more control, the developers have more control and more freedom. So that's kind of, at the moment at least, that's really motivating me to keep working in it. And I think there's sort of a lot of work to do there, both, as I said, both on the sort of freedom and openness side, and then also just like what are we going to use virtual reality for? Like, when we have all this potential for superpowers and all these cool things, but what are those first applications that are really going to make it take off? And both those things are sort of really exciting. And and we're just sort of seeing the start of augmented reality as well, and that's largely the same skill set as a developer. So it's a really cool investment, like a personal investment, to be familiar with these tools at the moment, because you get sort of all these new technologies that you can build and play with. Those are all the things that are exciting me at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you're excited, but you're also aware of, and just a healthy amount of respect for the potential downfalls of this powerful technology.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, how am I going to say this? There's so many people at the moment that are just so focused on having their own projects succeed. And this year, like, as I've taken a step back from the sort of startup world that I was in the last 2 years, and sort of fitting into more of an engineer role this year, I've sort of been doing more reflection and being able to take a step back and see what it's going, or look at some of the bigger picture stuff and not have to worry necessarily about, like, how many users are we going to have this next month, and like what features are we going to add next month. I can sort of look at things from the larger scale, and a lot of people don't have that luxury. A lot of my friends and a lot of people in the industry are just sort of making it work today, and working on making sure their app works and fixing bugs and working on new features for next month. I'm a little worried that there's not enough people thinking about the larger ramifications. And I think, as I said before, if you're wearing these goggles for 10 hours a day and we've screwed something fundamental, or we've screwed something up fundamentally, then that's really, really bad. Like, if we think smartphones and technology is damaging society today, then virtual reality is going to, and augmented reality, going to be way, way, way worse, or have the potential to be way worse. So we need to get it right. That's sort of my perspective at the moment.
Yeah, it's a good perspective, I think. And I'm seeing more and more people talk about these problems, and the current culture is so... we're aware of a lot of other issues, so hopefully we will continue to care about these problems. One last thing, what's the application that you are most excited about right now, other than one that you're creating?
Oh, so I'm... That's a good question. I think at the moment I'm still just looking forward to, like, better games. I think it's really, really important for us to nail gaming with VR. There's a lot of people, and myself included, sort of dedicating their careers to the next step. That, like, what are we going to do after gaming succeeds, or what can we, like, what are all these cool things that we can use virtual reality for? But I think it's very important. Like, we're still nowhere near reaching, like, the potential with gaming and the sort of 100 million plus hardcore gaming market. I think that's really, really important to get right. And I'm personally, like, I played a ton of Counter-Strike. I played a lot of shooters, and I play Onward a lot, and on Steam, and that's sort of my favorite VR shooter. And I think that's, like, an amazing game. And it's made by sort of one person and a few colleagues. It's a pretty small team. So I'm really, really looking forward to a better shooter. That's I think there's so much potential there. I really like Echo Arena, and I think they're launching, like, a shooter version of that as well. Just better games is what I'm still excited for. I think we're still very, very early in that genre.
Yeah, I mean, I totally hear you. Unfortunately, it seems like there's going to be you can think about it as like a three-prong problem. You've kind of got just all the problems that come with developing a good game, and then the fact that it's a new medium, and that all of the design paradigms haven't been decided yet, and you're pioneering those. And then the third problem, which I guess is kind of related to the second problem, which is motion sickness and stuff, because, like, I was playing Echo Arena, and it seemed like it was a very, very good game, but I just personally couldn't play it without getting sick. So
Yeah.
I didn't play very much, but it seemed like it would take some serious getting used to for me.
Yeah, I got lucky with. I usually get really motion sick, and I got lucky with Echo Arena in Lone Echo. I got it didn't make me sick, and I don't know if I'm still not sold on whether or not like VR legs are a thing that if you play VR for a long time that you get used to it, or you get used to the motion sickness. I still definitely feel sick in some of these games. But yeah, with Onward and Lone Echo, maybe I just like it enough that I just sort of deal with it. But yeah, it's definitely a big problem. And another problem with the gaming side of things is that the market just isn't there. So you can't get these bigger studios to invest a lot of time and money when there's just not a market. So it's kind of a blessing and a curse in that it's a blessing for these indie developers to come in and make a game that can sell sort of $1 million worth of games, but that's $1 million is nothing compared for like EA or something. So it's
Right.
yeah, it's an interesting time, but it's definitely a big opportunity for those indie developers. So yeah.
Yeah, definitely excited about it. Well, Hayden, can you? So first of all, really excited to have you on, and thank you for being on. Hope to talk to you again. But can you let everybody know how to, if you want people to get in touch with you or follow you, how they can do that?
Yeah. So thanks for having me. My Twitter handle is probably the best place to contact me. It's Hayden Lee 37, I believe. Yeah, Hayden Lee 37. And yeah, that's probably the best way. I'm trying to stick off Twitter as much as I can at the moment, but sort of my DMs are open, so you can shoot me a message there. And yeah, I'd love to chat with anybody who's just interested in chatting about social VR or web VR or Unity or any of these things.
Yeah, and also go give him a star on the networked AFrame GitHub project or contribute to it. Cool. Thank you so much, Hayden. Thanks for being on, man. I really appreciate it.
Cool. Thanks for having me.
Hi, guys. Thank you for listening to the podcast. So I'm not going to ask you for money or anything, but if you could please go to YouTube and search Synthetic Native and subscribe to our YouTube channel, where we also publish all of the podcast episodes and also are starting to put out other content. I would really, really appreciate it. It's much easier for me to figure out what the viewership is like and to engage with viewers through that medium. Or if you use Twitter, follow us on twitter.com/syntheticnative. Either of those platforms, you'd be doing me a huge favor. So yeah, thank you so much. And please let me know if there's any thoughts, comments, suggestions, concerns, questions, anything that you have for the podcast, the content that we've put out so far. And yeah, thank you so much for listening to Synthetic Native, and we will see you next time.